Hopefully people, okay. All right. We are live again for the moment. So none of you are here. So none of you are going to hear this explanation. You'll hear it when you watch the video, I guess. But the stream that you were all watching crashed due to some internet issues, which I've never had internet issues here at Monmouth before, but we are today. So we had to start a new stream. If you are still hanging out on YouTube, you'll probably see this new stream, and you can jump over here and log into this one. Well, unfortunately, once one ends, I can't just pick up and start it up again. I got to start a brand new one. So that's what we've done here. So we've started a new episode. I'm going to continue on from where I was. I'll probably drag my feet here a little bit and see if anybody, see a couple people figuring out that we've got a new stream we've started. So Heather, try typing something in the chat and see if you can put a note in there and make sure we're good. I want people to have a chance to see what we're going to talk about.
I put it in the chat under episode 11.
Okay. All right. So it looks like we got 4 people that have found us over here in the new stream. So, okay, we're going to keep going. Hopefully more of you will figure out what's going on and join us here in the new stream. Yeah. Thank you, Merle. So what I want to talk about in regards to planting depth. So I've had a lot of people comment. You may have observed this too. Soils were incredibly mellow this spring, especially if you're a strip tiller. My strips, I could have stuck my hand into my strips up to my forearm, just boom. I didn't need a spade. I didn't need a trowel. I didn't need to dig. They were just incredibly mellow, almost to the point where it was a problem. They were so mellow, still buffering really bad. So it may crash again. But so anyway, I think the mellowness of the soil might have led to even more than a normal amount of settling, once we did get some rain. And so we've really only had 2 significant rain events all spring. We had the Easter rain, which some of you hadn't planted corn yet at that time. A lot of you hadn't planted corn yet at that time. A lot of beans went in the week before Easter and even earlier than that. Not as much corn. And then we had the big rain event that we had 10 days ago, and a few isolated other small events, but basically we've had those 2 large rain events. And so what I think is happening in some cases is here's your soil line. Here's your planter trench. And normally when you're planting, on either side of the trench are a couple humps. And it is difficult to tell, when your seed's down here, hopefully it's tucked in nice and tight in the bottom of the trench. It's a little bit hard to tell, where do I measure to? Do I kind of like in my mind strike off the humps and get back to level? I think what's happening is I think a lot of people are their eye is deceiving them a little bit, and they're measuring from this line down to the seed, when really the line we need to measure from is that line, because those humps are going to wash away, spread out, disappear. This is actually where the soil surface is going to be, even if it doesn't settle. This isn't what I call settling with the humps going away. That's more just kind of leveling and things flattening out. And, if this distance here is 1.5 inches, and this distance here is 2 inches, that would explain a lot of what I see, because I talk to farmers all the time where we've got issues going on because of shallow planting. They are, they were out of the plant, they were out of the tractor, they were digging, they were checking, we're using our knuckles in some cases to measure. Now my second knuckle is not 2 inches. I've got short, fat little fingers, Well, not little, but they're short and fat, like the rest of me. So my second knuckle is about 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches. Some people's second knuckles 2.5 inches. If you got basketball player kind of hands, and so if you're using your knuckles, there's a little bit of error there, but I think there's also some error here where we're measuring from the highest point next to the furrow rather than from what's going to become the soil line eventually. And then on top of that, I think a lot of people are just a little bit gun shy. If 2 inches is okay, but boy, I don't want to accidentally be 2.5. So just to make sure I'm not 2.5, maybe I'll shoot for 1.75 inches. And then your shallow ones are 1.5 inches or less, and then you get some soil settling, or you got this going on, and then all of a sudden your shallow ones are at 1 inch, and the deepest ones you can find are at 1.5 inches. So we can tell based on I will draw my seedling again. You can tell. So here's your soil line. Here's your seed. Here's your seed roots. Here's your mesocotyl coming up. And let's say this is an appropriately planted seed, so it's got the crown in the right place. The distance from the seed to the soil line is always visible. And even when the seed's gone, you can still tell where the seed was attached. So you can tell how deep corn was planted when it's tasseling. You can tell how deep corn was planted when it's mature. As long as you can find the seed coat, or even just the point of attachment where the seed used to be, you can tell in August, how deep corn was planted. So, if it's 1 inch deep, I can tell in August it was 1 inch deep. So you don't have to tell me it was 2 inches deep when you planted it, because it's 1 inch deep now, and I can see that. So I guess the moral of the story is try your best to maintain that 2-inch planting depth. If you're nervous about planting 2 inches deep, try to get over that. Err on actually the deeper side rather than the shallower side, and we'll avoid things like rootless corn, and I think you'll actually have a better root system in general, and you might actually have higher yielding corn from the fact that you've got a better root system in general. So the corn's root system is designed by God and Mother Nature to develop properly when it's planted at least 2 inches deep. And anytime it's less than 2 inches deep, I'm going to say it's going to struggle a little bit. Now, it may eventually get the same root system, but it's not going to be as easy for that plant as Mother Nature intended it to be. So I'll get off that soapbox, and if all your corn's a good 2.25 inches deep, good for you. Well done, and we'll move on to my next topic. So the next thing I wanted to mention was something we call rapid growth syndrome, and Rachel sent me some pictures that she got. I could have took pictures of this yesterday too, because I was looking at this all day long. But I didn't do that, so I'm going to borrow her pictures. So what Rachel captured in these pictures is kind of more the aftermath of rapid growth syndrome. So can you see that yellow leaf? That's a close-up of it. I'm going to change pictures. So that one, you can kind of see that one plant out there that's got that yellow leaf just standing up there waving at you. The reason that leaf is yellow is because for probably a week prior to it emerging as a yellow leaf, it was wrapped up tight in the whorl. And when that plant is wrapped up tight and the leaves are not unfurling properly as it grows and it's pushing up, it bends itself over. And so you end up with these plants that are wrapped up tight and growing in a kind of a U shape, bent. In some cases, the top of the plant's bent clear down to the ground. It looks awful. Looks an awful lot like a plant growth regulator herbicide issue. And the reason it looks like a plant growth regulator herbicide issue is because the rapid growth syndrome is caused by an imbalance of natural plant hormones, which are plant growth regulator herbicides, are synthetic plant growth hormones. And they do the same thing as the actual plant growth hormones. And so I'm going to tell you, I have zero ability in my mind to tell the difference. So let's say you just sprayed a field with dicamba post emergence, and you see this. There's no way to know, was it going to happen anyway, and it's rapid growth syndrome, or was it caused by the application of dicamba? Now, oftentimes, if you're paying attention, you'll see these plants that are wrapped up and bent over before you even spray the field. We've had this going on it started after those 3 hot days about 2 weeks ago. So we normally talk about and that's why we call it rapid growth syndrome. It's normally happens when the plants are growing really fast. When we got ideal growing conditions. You've got plentiful nutrients, you got plentiful moisture, you got plentiful sunlight, you got warm temperatures, and the plant is just growing so fast. And you might be thinking, oh, wait a minute, Lance. It's been cold as heck. It's been dry. We haven't had ideal growing conditions really ever. This spring we've had ideal planting conditions a lot of times, but we haven't necessarily had a lot of warm, humid, moist, sunny days. Those are coming next week according to the weather forecast. Make your herbicide work better. So what I think happened is I think we had those 3 hot days. We had that day it was up in the 90s. Well, it was actually two weeks ago when we were on Ask the Agronomist. I was joking with Rachel, who's from Kansas, that when the wind's blowing and it's 95 degrees and the humidity's low, it feels like Kansas here in Monmouth. And we had some really warm days, and then right after that, we got the rain, and it went back to April. And I think that, that plant was just ready to go, gangbusters. You gave it some heat, it took off, and then it slammed on the brakes when it got cold for a week. And it got a little jacked up, probably got some imbalance of some of its plant growth hormones, grew a little wacky, and that's what rapid growth syndrome is. Now, we do see hybrid differences. That's not something we rate hybrids for. I have identified one particular hybrid. It's one of my favorites, 11041. It's a 110-day Tricepta. It seems to be more likely to express that rapid growth syndrome. Interestingly enough, that hybrid's also sensitive to dicamba. So it's a little bit unique, a little bit odd, and a little bit interesting that the plant that is more likely to look like it's suffering from dicamba injury actually is more likely to suffer from dicamba injury. And the other thing that I've been asked several times is I'm getting ready to spray my corn. I can see there's rapid growth syndrome in my field. I know it's not caused by herbicide because there's no growth regulator herbicide been applied to that field yet this season, but I'm getting ready to. Should I wait to spray my corn because that's going on, because I'm getting ready to spray it with dicamba? Am I going to make it worse? And I do think that there is, maybe some rationale behind your question. And I do think that you could possibly, cause more of that symptomology to show up, or you could cause them to stay wrapped up a little bit longer. But the alternative is your corn gets too big to spray, your weeds get too big to kill, and that's worse. So I don't think it's going to do a lot of damage to your crop. It's more cosmetic than it is actually harmful. So I would go ahead and spray the field as you plan to, do it timely. We'll hope that it doesn't, make the situation that much worse. But I think the alternative of waiting until it's not doing that and then spraying it is a worse scenario. So I would go ahead and do your application as you had planned. Don't change your rate. Don't switch products. Don't delay. Get it done right. And I think I think everything will be okay. But that's what we call rapid growth syndrome, and we're seeing quite a bit of that. And it all happened after those 3 hot days, followed by a nasty cold week. So I think that combination of events, and you're only going to see it in the bigger, older corn, because that's the corn that was getting ready to take off and grow really fast. So I haven't seen as much of that in the late April and May planted corn, because it's not quite big enough to show it yet. We might see that happen in that later planted corn in a week or 10 days when it's at the right stage of growth to show it. Right now, we're tending to see it more in the, mid-April planted corn, which is mostly V5, V6, V7 corn. And it's getting to that stage of its life where it's really, 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 trying to grow fast. And so that's where we more often see that. While we're talking about weird growth in corn, we touched on this a little bit 2 weeks ago. Rachel had actually already observed this going on in her territory, and I started getting calls actually 2 weeks ago. We did have a bit of a voodoo day in corn. Probably the worst voodoo days this year for us in corn ended up being April 29th and 30th. And we had a tremendous amount, in some cases, of corn that leafed out underground as it's emerging. And what happens is that as that spike is pushing up through the soil, there's a kind of a round, hard cap on the end of that spike that kind of gives it a point that lets it push up through stuff. If that cap splits open, and what's supposed to happen is, as soon as that cap pokes through the soil surface, you don't need it anymore because it's already up. It splits open, and that allows the leaves to start to come out, and then the leaves form. Once that cap splits open, you can't, it's like trying to push a rope. You can't push that up through the soil. If anything causes that coleoptile to split, before it's up, that plant's done for, because you can't push, like I say, it's like trying to push a rope. You can't push those as those leaves start to come out. And you've seen what corn looks like when it leaves out underground. It gets all wadded up, gets all twisted up. And yeah, if it's close to the surface, sometimes it'll kind of stumble out of the ground, and you can tell those plants that almost leafed out underground because they kind of come out on a 45-degree angle this way or that way, and they just got a little bit of a funky look to them. They're fine, but they almost became a non-existent plant because they almost leafed out underground. Something about the environment of that April 29th and 30th planting date, our internet problems seem to have resolved themselves. It's working fine now, so who knows? So, and my best guess is we had a small rainfall event right after that planting window. So I think on maybe like the night of the 30th, I think a lot of people had 2, 3, 4 tenths, maybe half an inch. It wasn't a big rain. It wasn't a hard rain. It was a cold rain. It didn't necessarily cause a crust, but it was a rainfall event. And sometimes even a small rainfall event can be a factor in things. And then right after that rainfall event, if you remember, like on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th of May, maybe, or 1st, 2nd, 3rd of May, the first few days of May, we dipped into the high 30s a couple nights. We had like 3 nights in a row where we were, flirting with 40s and high 30s. I mean, it got cold. And, we'd had some warm weather, then we had that cold stress. We had a little bit of moisture. There's also herbicides that can be a factor in corn leafing out underground. Our acid-amylid group of corn herbicides, or corn grass herbicides, pre-emergent corn grass herbicides, can be a factor in that. And actually, the first couple fields I looked at did kind of, and it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. There's a lot of seed people out there that just love to blame chemicals on why the corn didn't come up. And I got one of our CP reps in there. They hate that when the seed guy goes, "That's probably herbicide injury," and the chemical person's going, "That was probably crappy seed, probably why it didn't come up." And so it's actually better than it used to be for you, the farmer, because the seed companies and the chemical companies, you didn't really like it when we all got together and we all merged. But now, we're kind of blaming ourselves, if we try to blame, because the same company's selling you both products in some cases. So it has helped all the blame game that goes on between the seed industry and the chemical industry. And a lot of seed people, the first thing on their mind is when they're trying to explain why their corn didn't come up, they're looking for some sort of chemical explanation to the problem. And the chemical people are looking for some sort of seed quality or weather explanation to the problem. And everybody's trying to blame somebody else. So I was in a couple fields when I first started to see this. I would have to admit, and I don't like to blame chemicals for anything because I'm a chemical guy and I like chemicals. But even I thought, there's probably something going on here. And then I ran into a field, and I'm really glad I ran into this field. And it actually happened to be the worst field of corn leafing out underground that I have run into. It was like 50%. I mean, it was a no-brainer replant. That field got planted, had not been sprayed. This grower typically sprays after he plants. And it rained like 4/10 right after he planted. So he couldn't spray for 3 or 4 days. So when the field got dry enough to spray, he sprayed it. And then it didn't rain for 2 or 3 weeks. So that chemical that he sprayed after the rain on the surface of a dry soil never got activated before the corn came up. So that corn that leafed out underground and did not come up had not been exposed to any herbicide. So that one field, showed me that even in the absence of any influence from herbicide, we still got bad leafing out underground going on. So I can't say that in some cases a herbicide maybe didn't play a role in what's going on. But that one field showed me that, well, it can happen without any impact from herbicide. So there's a possibility that herbicide had nothing to do with it in anybody's field. But, in that case, it's about got to be the weather because the seed quality is fine on that seed. It germinated, it was growing vigorously, but something caused it to leaf out before it emerged. And that's not really a seed quality issue. Insect feeding can do that sometimes, like a wireworm hits it, that can cause it to happen. One of the nastiest things that you'll ever see, I've only seen this a couple times. This is kind of a rare situation, but if you've got really cloddy ground, so you plant your corn into a bunch of clods, and that spike's coming up there, and when your soil is not really soil, it's just like a pile of small boulders. The sunlight kind of gets down in around those boulders and cracks and crevices. This can happen if your seed furrow splits open too. And let's say when your plant's about an inch above or inch below the surface, it gets enough sunlight that it thinks it's up. And so coleoptile splits open, leaves start to emerge. And then let's say it rains 1.5 inches that night and melts all those clods together. You'll have almost no emergence in that scenario there. Very rare that would happen, but that'll make a mess out of a field of corn there. So there are some funky things that can happen, but I think this one was primarily just that cold weather stress, affected that plant in a bad way. There are hybrid differences to all this stuff, so you might see some hybrids affected more or less than others. But that's something I want to touch on because there were a few people that were shocked and really disappointed in how awful their corn stand was that they planted the 29th or the 30th. And one of the growers I was with, he had corn planted the 28th, 29th, and 30th. 28th was fine. 29th was a train wreck. 30th was better than the 29th, but not as good as the 20. I mean, just hours were making a difference in how good or bad that stand of corn was. So soil type differences, planting date differences, even time of day that you planted differences, and it was all about how close were you or what was the gap between when it was planted and when it germinated, when it started to grow, and when that drastic weather change happened. So kind of an interesting phenomenon. Luckily, there wasn't a ton of corn planted in that window. Some of you were already done by then. Some of you didn't really have that window because maybe it was too wet, or some of you maybe were waiting because you didn't like the sound of the weather that was coming, after that window. But that, if you planted anything the 29th and 30th of April and you haven't looked at it, take a peek at that because there's a chance that stand may be less than perfect. While we're on the subject of stands, I saw another thing that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine on the way here and I was driving pretty fast this month, so probably shouldn't have been field scouting as I'm speeding through the countryside to get here. But I saw this bean field, and you can tell me if you've ever seen this before. So here's the 15-inch bean rows, no-till field, nice looking stand of beans. You know, I didn't walk out there and do a stand count, but I'm going to say probably 100,000 ish. I mean, something north of 80,000 at least. And as I drove on a little further and I look back, I see, there's a second crop out there at a slight angle that appears to have almost the same perfect stand. So I don't know whose field this is, so I can't call them out. Even if I knew, I wouldn't call them out. But somebody was not willing to be patient enough to let their soybeans come up, and they pulled the trigger on a replant a little too soon. And so now we've got probably 200,000 plants per acre growing in this field. And I would guess on average, a stand of 200,000 plants, which we used to think was a good thing, versus a stand of 110,000 plants, which is what we think is a good thing today, probably a 5 or 10 bushel yield hit from being too thick. That varies, depends on the year, depends on a lot of factors. So I hope this gentleman got about $120 an acre out of his hail insurance or his federal crop for a replant, because that'll be enough to offset the lost yield that it will suffer because of the unnecessary replanting. So just a good reminder that soybeans are tougher than you give them credit for. It's okay for soybeans to be thin. You know, my magic number is 70,000. And I did a dealer training yesterday, and we had a really good discussion, because I get it. I've experienced this sentiment myself, and I've felt this from growers. You might believe that 70,000 is enough. It's not that you don't believe 70,000 is enough, but it kind of irks you that you spent money on 120 or 130 or 140,000 seeds. I hear seeds expensive. And then you got 70. So I get the argument that, well, now, dang it, if I wanted 70, I would have planted 90. I planted 120 or 130 or 140, so I'm not going to be happy with 70. I can live with 70, but I'm not happy with 70 because I wasted, in your mind, $30 or $40 an acre on seed. Because if 70 was my goal, I should have planted 85. So why am I planting 120 or 130 or 140 if 70 is my goal? Well, I'm not going to say 70 is our goal. 70 is kind of the bottom end of the good range. For me, the sweet spot's probably somewhere between 90 and 110. And 70 to 90 is almost as good as 90 to 110. But we had a good discussion at this training yesterday about, well, what can I do differently to get a higher percentage? Because, corn doesn't work this way, right? You plant 35,000 seeds of corn, and if you don't get something close to that, you're dissatisfied with that. So in corn, we're used to getting closer to what we plant than we get out of soybeans. So why is that? So the first thing I'm going to remind you is, all corn has a worm germ of 95% plus. Sometimes it's 98, 99. Soybeans are normally tagged at 90%. They could be 94. They could be 91. If they're less than 90, then they're going to be tagged at 85. And if they're less than 85, they're going to be tagged at 80. So the seed company cannot legally tag them, and they want to leave themselves a little cushion too. To have if they're 89 and a half, we can't round up to 90. If the germ test we do says they're 89.5, we're going to tag them at 85. If the germ test says they're 90.1, we'll probably tag them at 85, because there's a chance that, if they lose a 0.5% just sitting around, then they're mislabeled at 90. So soybeans you're not going to get as close to 100% of what you plant up in soybeans as you do in corn, even if everything's perfect. So that's the first point. And then we started making a list, and I should have wrote this down yesterday. I'm just going to go from memory. So you can all be, I wish you were here in a live audience. You could shout it out. So think about what's all the things that influence how good soybeans grow. So the group yesterday, the first thing they came up with was tillage. Those of you who know me know what a diehard no-tiller I am. I mean, it pains me, but the best looking beans every spring are on work ground, and this spring that's more true than normal. So if you care about nothing else than getting more of the soybeans you plant up, that means you need to be working your bean ground. So another thing is, remove residue. Another thing is plant warm soil. Another thing that's also unpopular with some people in this room would be don't put any herbicide on. There's even some seed treatments that can sometimes slow seed down a little bit. This is another one. Plant your beans in 30-inch rows. Let's see what else. I would say have row cleaners on your planter. And that kind of, there's a lot of people think you can't have row cleaners on a 15-inch row planter. That's wrong, by the way. You can. Costs a lot because you got twice as many rows, but you can have row cleaners on a 15-inch row planter. I've done that. So really everything, and this is kind of related to the plant in warm soil, but and this is a little bit ironic because this is what we used to do. Plant your beans in May. Everything on that list. Oh, I'll add this one. No cover crop, because that's just adding residue. Everything on that list will help you get more of the beans that you put in the soil to turn into a plant. But, there's good reasons we don't want to do tillage. There's really good reasons we don't want to remove residue. There's really good reasons why we want to plant our beans early. And it's a kind of a mutually exclusive thing, I guess is the way I would say it. If you're going to plant early, this is the advantage that, so if any of you have ever seen Alex Harrell talk, does a great job talking about high yield soybeans. He's the 200 bushel guy from Georgia. He can plant early in a 63-degree soil. He's in Georgia. We are not in Georgia. You can't plant early in a warm soil in Illinois very often. And even if it is warm the day you plant, it's not going to stay that way, forever. And if the soil was warm when you planted your beans April 10th and they were up in 5 days, they'd get froze off about 3 years out of 5. So a lot of this stuff, you could wish you could plant into warm soil, but if you're going to plant into warm soil, that means you're going to plant your beans in May. That means you're going to give up on the benefits of early planted soybeans. So, the no herbicide thing. And I told the group yesterday, if Roundup was what it was 20 years ago and we could use dicamba any old way we wanted, I wouldn't put any pre on, because I could kill the weeds post. I wouldn't need the pre. But that's not the world we live in today. We got to have the pre. We need a pre that's controlling 80, 85, 90% of our weeds, because the post programs we have today can't kill 100% of our weeds. So not putting herbicide on, there was a popular practice when we could still spray post-emergence dicamba called row and go. Row and go was amazing because you planted your seed with no herbicide in the ground. You let the beans get up, and then you sprayed the field with a residual program that can go on post, Roundup and dicamba. That was beautiful. Those beans came up better every year than the beans that had pre-emergence herbicides on. Everybody likes to blame Monsanto people for in the Roundup Ready era when we quit using pre's and soybeans, and everybody acts like, well, you dummies, why'd you do that? Well, because they're a pain in the butt. They're expensive. They don't always work well. They don't always get activated, and they stress our crop. There isn't. The only soybean pre that I can think of that actually doesn't cause much stress on soybeans is Command. Nobody's using clomazone anymore. That was probably the gentlest pre on soybeans. Today we got to have our PPOs for the best. I mean, they're the best water hemp tools we've got in the toolbox. They're also the most stressful on soybeans. Sencor is a great tool in the toolbox, also stressful on soybeans. Prowl, Treflan, it doesn't matter what soybean residual chemistry you're using. They're all a little bit hard on the bean, and they all slow the beans down a little bit. And when weather conditions are adverse, they're all going to make it harder for your beans to come up. But we got to have them, so that doesn't matter. You just got to put that out of your head. So, seed treatments, we're big promoters of Ep11 on our early planted beans to keep sudden death, at bay a little bit. You can't prevent it, but you can manage it. Well, it's well known that there's a little bit of a crop response from Ep11 when it interacts with your herbicide, that's a little more of a response. And so that's yet another thing that, slowing your emergence of your beans down. So 30-inch rows. How many of you have observed that the 30-inch row beans just seem to come up better no matter what? Well, they do. Why is that? Because there's a bean about every inch and a half. And at 140,000, if you're planting 140,000, in every foot of your row, there's 8 beans. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oops, there's 9 there. So you got 8 beans in every foot if you're dropping 140,000. They can lift a brick and put off when they're working together and helping each other push. When you're in 15-inch rows, you've got half that many. So you've got 4 per foot. And 4 per foot does not come up as good as 8 per foot. So just the fact that they're closer together and they can help each other more. The other thing that makes a big difference in how the planter works is, if you've ever noticed a lot of 15-inch row planters, when the beans start to come up, it looks like they're 30-inch rows because the splitter rows didn't do as good a job of putting seed in the ground as the main frame rows did. So those main frame rows, which is what you would plant your corn with if you use the same planter for corn and beans, they've got better downforce typically. You might have more bells and whistles on those rows. You probably got row cleaners on those rows because those are your corn rows, and corn's your baby. So your corn planter is set up to do a better job in many cases than your bean planter is. And if you've got a split row planter, your main frame rows are going to do a better job getting seed in the ground. The other advantage of 30-inch rows, if you want to, and this is why I'd recommend doing it, if you're going to plant no-till beans in 30-inch rows, you got corn stalk row here, you got corn stalk row here, plant your beans there. So you can completely avoid the old corn row, just plant them straight, go right with the old corn rows, and just split the mills. You're never going to plant through a root ball. You're never going to, what's most people do at 15-inch rows? They plant on a slight angle. So every row is crossing the old corn row time after time after time after time, all the way through the field. I personally would prefer to plant them straight and try to get 2 15-inch rows in between each 30-inch stalk row and keep out of the old stalk row. Hard to do that perfectly, but every if your corn row spacing is different than your soybean row spacing, sometime you're going to have to cross that old corn row. And even if you're doing vertical tillage, it's still harder to plant into the old corn row. Now, the more aggressive vertical tillage you do, the less of an impact that is. And that's the kind of tillage that, has kind of become acceptable. It's still considered no-till, which is a bit of a stretch with as aggressive as some of this vertical tillage is. But, a lot of no-tillers are doing a lot of tillage. But they're not doing as much tillage as the guys that are, there's some guys that rip their stalks, hit them with a soil finisher, and plant their beans. Those are going to be the best emerging beans when we have challenging conditions. So all these things, if you say my number one goal is I want to plant 100,000 and I want to get 90. In theory, 90% germ seed. If everything's perfect, you can plant 100 and get 90. If you want to plant 100 and get 90 consistently, you're going to have to do some of the things or a lot of the things on this list. And a lot of us don't want to do the things on this list, or we can't do the things on this list for good agronomic reasons. So we're going to have to continue to plant a little extra soybean seed to make sure that we get the 70,000 that we got to have. Hopefully we'll get 80 or 90 or 100, and how much extra you need to plant, that is your call. I plant 120, hoping to get 90 to 110. Some people are planting 140 because they'd like to have 120 to 130. 120 to 130 is more than you need. So I don't think you need to plant 140. But 140, I would have, if I'd have planted 140 instead of 120, instead of spots at 60 and 70, which is where my thin spots are, my thin spots would be 80 or 90. And so I would have a better stand if I had put another 20,000 seeds out there of extra. So that's your call, how much extra you want to do. I wouldn't ever plant more than 140 unless we're like planting late or something weird's going on. And I think in most cases, on most soils, you don't even have to plant 140.
Lance, would now be a good time to cover herbicide carryover?
Yes, it would. Or anything herbicide for that matter. I haven't talked much about your world yet. So Heather asked a good question about herbicide carryover. So if you've noticed places in your corn or bean fields where you think things look a little funky, depending on what you're seeing, you might, experience some herbicide carryover this year. I've seen a lot of foam-safen carryover in corn, from soybeans to corn. So that's a PPO product that used to be sold as Reflex, as a post-applied product. And back when we used Reflex post, nobody realized that product actually has really good soil activity. So now it's become kind of popular because it is the safest PPO chemistry that you can use pre. It's the least stressful to your soybean crop. It's also highly persistent in the soil. And so if you're using products like Prefix, or even people that use Warren Ultra, in some cases as a pre, to, again, try to, there's a lot of people out there that kind of got a bad taste in their mouth about the PPOs. I think that's unfortunate because I wish everybody was using a good PPO-based soybean pre, because those are the best water hemp products. But, they can also stress your crop. So if you've been trying to get away from PPOs, you could possibly be using a product with foam-safen in it. And it causes some kind of unique symptomology in corns. The only thing I know that does this, and it's very distinctive, you'll get brown veins. The veins on the corn plant will kind of die, and that leaf will kind of deteriorate, and it loses its, because what gives the leaf its strength is the rigidity of the veins. And once you've destroyed the veins, the leaf just kind of falls down, and then it kind of falls apart. And you might see just some brown veins and a couple dilapidated leaves, and it'll grow right through that and be fine. Where it's bad enough, like in overlap areas or sprayer slowed down and we put on a 2 or 3x rate, depends on pH, depends on soil type, depends on rainfall. The overriding factor that's causing more herbicide carryover this year is the dry fall and the dry spring. So it takes moisture. Every herbicide has a rotational restriction. Almost every herbicide, every soil residual herbicide has a rotational restriction. And that rotational restriction is going to be in months. Might be 3 months, might be 6 months, might be 9 months. Some are 12. And the crop makes a difference too. So some crops are more sensitive. So Reflex or Fomosafen has I believe a 9-month rotational restriction from beans to corn. Well, it's easily been more than 9 months since you sprayed that product in last year's soybeans till you planted corn. But it was a really dry 9 months. And so when it's really dry at certain rates in certain situations, it doesn't break down as fast as it typically does. The other products, then this would go the opposite direction. This would be a common corn program that might show some symptomology in your soybeans, would be some of the strong residual HPPD chemistry. So the two strongest residual post HPPD products would be mesotrione and Impact. Our Lotus has residual, but it doesn't last as long as those other two products, which, some people don't like that from a weed control standpoint, because you're not going to get quite as much residual out of that, but it's not going to hang around and irritate your soybeans next year either. So those are probably the two most common things you'll see. You could see some HPPD, which in soybeans that will be yellowing, and that's when it's a higher dose, it'll be a whitening of the soybean leaves. And soybeans just always look kind of ugly anyway, and that's a really tough situation to be in. Your beans are kind of yellow, your beans are not growing good. You used a product last year that has a little bit of carryover potential. Is that why my beans are yellow and growing slow? Well, probably not, because your beans are always yellow and grow slow. But if you can find overlap areas, if you can find point rows and places where and we don't have much overlap these days with the sprayer technology we have today. I mean, the overlap area on sprayers, less than a foot. Back in the old days, it might have been 10 or 15 feet. So it was easy to find those overlap areas. But the sprayer, and you used to be, when you went around a corner, the inside of the boom, you puked out like a 5x rate, and the outside of the boom, you put like next to nothing on because it's moving really fast. But with the exact apply technology they have, the sprayer is smart enough to put less on the inside, more on the outside, so it keeps your rate, probably not perfect, but keeps the rate closer to right as that sprayer is going around a corner. So, we don't have as many overlap areas, we don't have as many over applications, but just the weather conditions are such that, expectation is, we're using more strong residual chemistry in both corn and soybeans. We're using higher rates of residual chemistry than we used to use in both corn and soybeans. That combined with the weather, will probably lead to, not going to be a big deal. It's usually more of a cosmetic thing than it is, if you've got a, spot the size of this table, in your cornfield in a corner where the sprayer hit it this way and the sprayer hit it that way and the sprayer hit it this way, and you got a 3x rate of something, and you got some sick corn in a small area. Yeah, it's frustrating, but it's not really going to impact your pocketbook. But I have been in a few fields where, due to some kind of weird situations, there might be 3 or 4 acres in a field that's showing some pretty good symptomology, and that's a little a little bigger deal, obviously. The other thing I want to touch on real fast, and we're over time, is some thoughts on herbicide applications in corn and soybeans. So I would say in general, the cuticle layer on our corn leaves is pretty thin, pretty non-existent. We haven't had a lot of hot weather, which is typically what makes that waxy cuticle on that leaf thicken up. So corn's pretty easy to burn right now. So if you're putting 4 or 5 things in your corn post program and throwing in a V5 fungicide, like I like you to, and you throw in a little crop oil or MSO or surfactant, because a couple of the herbicides in the mix call for that. And if you start looking down your list of things, and well, okay, atrazine, that's got solvents and emulsifiers in it. Any EC formulation or SC formulation, any liquid, there's emulsifiers and solvents in that, and those products are, that's a lot of what gives it its heat. And when you talk about heating stuff up to get better weed control, well, sometimes when you heat stuff up, you get a little more crop response than you would like to see. So the burn that we sometimes get on corn is kind of a surfactant burn. It's not really even the active ingredients that are causing that. It's more the oil in the mix. Some of that oil is in the formulation of the product, and some of that oil we added to the mix because we were adding an adjuvant to the mix. If you got a little nitrogen in the mix, that heats stuff up even more. And by the time you throw 2 or 3 different herbicides and some adjuvants in there, and maybe add in a fungicide, we got a hot little brew there. And so if you're seeing more crop response than you like in those applications, you can probably back down on the surfactants that you're adding into that mix, because generally, can't say this 100% of the time, but generally, if conditions are such that corn is easy to burn, I hope weeds are also easy to kill. And if weeds are easy to kill, we don't have to burn the piss out of the corn to get the weeds killed. Now, if you do burn the piss out of the corn, it's not really hurting anything. It's mostly cosmetic. Very little yield damage, if any, is occurring there. It's going to grow out of it. It's going to be fine. But I get it. It looks bad, and if your neighbor sprayed on a different day and didn't get burned, or he used a different program, didn't get burned, and your corn scorched, makes you feel bad. I get it. It bothers me too. So the other stuff I will say real quickly on herbicide applications, the weather we're experiencing right now is not the greatest for Liberty efficacy. I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of fields of beans that need sprayed. Next week's weather looks better. I hate to make a recommendation to wait, but just be aware that if you're making Liberty applications when it's cool and cloudy and dry, that's not the best environmental conditions really for any herbicide. So if you got Roundup in with it, that's going to help. If you got the rate up, that's going to help. If you got the right surfactant system in, that's going to help. If you got really good coverage and a lot of water, that's going to help. So there are things you can do to help yourself. Be aware that I hate waiting. Waiting is almost always the worst thing to do. And I guess if you think you can wait till next week when it's warmer and still get all the acres covered timely, that's probably what I would do. But if you've got fields that need sprayed, I'd probably get them sprayed. Just make sure you got plenty of water, plenty of surfactant, plenty of nitrogen, plenty of rate of the right products, and we'll hope for the best from a weed control standpoint. But I think if you do the math, a lot of our soybean pre's have been on the ground for 45 days plus. Our target's somewhere in that 30 to 40 day window. It's been so cool that you can probably stretch that a little bit, but I don't want you trying to stretch it to 60 days before you get your post, program on. And I was in a lot of fields yesterday, got 6-inch tall water hemp in them already, cornfields and bean fields. And so that's getting plenty big to be killing consistently. So, I think most of the acres of April planted beans need sprayed now, whether they look like they need sprayed or not. So it's time to be rolling aggressively on soybean post applications. And we're right in the middle of corn post applications. So there's a lot of acres that are ready to be sprayed. Now, does it have to all be done tomorrow? No, but we need to be rolling. So I guess do your best to, pick the best day, pick the best time, pick the best products, do the best you can, and hope for the best. But just be aware it is time to be rolling. So if you've got customers that want you spraying their crop, do it. And the customers that think it's too early, start working on them to change that attitude, because as soon as you get the guy done that wants his done, then you need to do the guy that doesn't want his done yet, because he still wants you to wait. And just remember that, usually waiting is not, that's your enemy, not your friend. And you don't really get a better result very often from waiting. If you spray, we get a good kill, and we get another flush later, that's not a bad thing. That's why we've got resprays. That's why we've got products that we can do that with. And if that's your scenario, sometime in early June, we'll hit that field again. We'll clean up that next flush, and everything will be great. What more often happens is we wait a little too long to make the first application. We kill about 85 or 90% of the weeds, and we booger up the other 10 or 15%. And then sometime in July, somebody realizes, damn, there's weeds out there. And they think it's a new flush. It's really not. It's the same old pissed off ones that we almost killed the first time, but now they're bigger and badder and madder. And we're out there doing things that we shouldn't be, too late, trying to kill weeds that we can't kill, when we could have done a better job, up front. So go early, scout your fields after you spray. If you got another flush coming, we'll deal with that. We got plenty of time where we're still on label, kill small weeds in June, following up after, the first application in May. You're way better off to make your first application in May and make your second application in June than you are to make your first application in June and your second application in July. That's what we need to quit doing. And the best way to quit doing that is to get the field sprayed earlier. You'll find that the products work better. You'll find that you don't always have to respray that field. And guys are always worried about, well, I don't want to make a third pass. I don't want to make a third pass. I don't want to make a third, you've done a burn down and a pre, you're going to do your post. Well, if you need another post, that's the third pass. What people don't realize is we're already putting 3 passes on most of the acres. We're just doing it poorly because the second and the third one were too late. If you make the second one at the right time, even if you still need the third one, it will be more timely than it typically is. So just something to keep in mind, and encourage your customers to let you spray their fields. And if you're self-applied, you can get your own field sprayed. So anything else, Miss Heather?
Do we need to call out Liberty and corn? Not without being a commercial on traits.
In what regard?
Just the watch outs.
Yes, of
spring,
things
Liberty.
You can't use it on.
Yeah. That was a request for Rachel. In a personal chat.
Okay, so where the ladies are going there is it's become a little bit of a trend that I don't like, frankly. I think it's a really bad idea to be using Liberty Post in corn. Liberty Post is the best product we have today in soybeans. Better than dicamba, better than 2,4-D. It is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, especially in regards to water hemp. We do not need to put more pressure on Liberty. There are plenty of products you can use in corn that are not called Liberty. So I am not a fan of Liberty applications in corn, with one exception. I do like to use it in a maybe a crop removal standpoint from a replant situation. So we do sometimes recommend replanting with Smart Stacks so that you can spray Liberty and kill your double pro that you planted the first time. I'm okay with that. But to rely on Liberty and corn for weed control, I think is short-sighted and will just more quickly ruin that product. So not a fan of that. But if you're going to do that, recognizing the DeKalb brand, the only corn hybrids you can spray Liberty on are Smart Stacks and Smart Stacks Pro. If the word Smart Stacks is not in the product's name, it is not resistant to Liberty. So that means that Triceptas, Double Pros, and where it gets confusing for people, you used to be able to say you can spray Liberty on your rootworm corn for DeKalb. Can't say that anymore because we got a rootworm corn product, VT4 Pro, that is not resistant to Liberty. So there's 2 corn products from DeKalb that you can use Liberty on. That would be Smart Stacks and Smart Stacks Pro. Other than that, be a dead or at least a severely injured field if you forget that and spray it with Liberty. So is that the public safety message that Rachel was looking for? Mm-hmm. So, okay. So apologize for the clunkiness of today's episode, and appreciate those of you that found your way to the second. And we went a full hour on the second one, so I'm kind of overdoing it here a bit today. But anyway, thanks for your time, and thanks for being here. We'll be back in 2 weeks, which is what, about the 13th or 12th or 4th, something like that, of June. Can you believe it's almost June already? This year's almost half over. That's insane. So anyway, thanks again. Appreciate your time. Take care.